have people. Good morning, everybody. We're just waiting for the waiting room to empty into the main room here. So a couple of minutes, and I can see we've got 20 and the numbers are climbing rapidly. So we'll be with you shortly. Make yourself comfortable, adjust your seats, relax, maybe a bit of shoulder movement to get yourself limbered up for the session. Okay, here we go. We've got 25, 26. Okay, I think we're ready to go. So let me spotlight myself and welcome everybody to the session today. Just a note for everybody, I am going to be recording this so we can use this in the future, and you can get a copy and share it with your friends. So this is being recorded. If you don't wish to be heard, if you like, I think as we're in webinar mode, you won't be seen or heard anyway, but the questions in the chat can be anonymous, so don't worry about that. But we are recording for your information. Okay, so we, the Housing Diversity Network, are proud to be holding this webinar as part of our Action Against Intolerance series. And today we are discussing tackling transphobia. Over recent years, there's been an insidious rise in instances of transphobia across the UK. And in fact, America, Ireland, Australia, and many other English-speaking countries. This is exemplified by the ongoing systemic exclusion of transgender people and neglect or dismissal of trans issues. We're seeing a barrage of prejudice rhetoric emanating from UK politics, online, and in the mainstream media. And cases of verbal abuse and physical violence are still prevalent. Debates are often carried out in the media without involvement of trans or non-binary voices. People talk about us, promote misrepresentations and misunderstanding without any right of reply. It would seem that the use of the term free speech is used to platform so-called gender-critical voices as if it were a balanced viewpoint. We're now coming to the end of Transgender Awareness Week, which ran from the 13th to the 20th of this month, November. I hope you've seen many positive messages out there on social media. And please remember that tomorrow is Transgender Day of Remembrance, where we celebrate or commemorate or remember those who've sadly passed away in the last 12 months or in the last 50 odd years. So I hope you will learn a lot from this session, with plenty of information to take back to your organisation, such as how transphobia manifests itself in society, how housing associations can work to protect transgender colleagues, tenants, residents and customers, and how we as organisations and individuals can promote acceptance of trans and non-binary people in society. So I'm joined this morning by an esteemed panel who themselves identify as trans, non-binary or genderqueer. We have Andi Maratos, CEO of Kuss, a gender identity mattering charity. Majojo Kuss, a program manager for corporate travel and management, team member for diversity and inclusion groups and initiatives at the Expedia Group. And Georgie Williams, a PhD student at the University College Dublin, who specialises in non-cisgender identities from a transnational perspective. So before we start, I'd like to just frame this as a safe space. We would love your questions. We all have our own boundaries, so be respectful, but we are here to learn. I'd like to introduce the concept of the being intolerant of intolerance. In society, we think we have to have free speech where we have to create space for all views, but we often have to be intolerant of the intolerance. Otherwise, we allow extremist views to propagate in society. But I also believe that tolerance is a horrible word. Who wants to be tolerated? Personally, I want to be embraced. I want to be celebrated for who I am, not put up with or barely tolerated. So please put your questions in the chat. I'll remind you once again that we are recording this so we can share the recording after the event for those who've missed it. So without further ado, I'd like to start by introducing our first panelist, Andi Maratos. Andi, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, Joe. Thanks for having me. So yeah, I'm the chief exec of Kuss. We're a mental wellbeing charity supporting trans, non-binary and questioning people and their families and friends. We've been around since 2005, but I didn't get involved until 2010. Back in the day, I was a residence manager for student halls. So this particular panel is really personal to me because I've spent a long time in student accommodation and in housing. And as part of that, I was recommended to do a counselling course to be a little bit more able to understand what was going on with my students to support them better. It was a bit of 50-50 pastoral and buildings management role. Do a counselling course, you need to do counselling placements. One of the placements I ended up with was at Chrysalis, and I just stayed. I qualified, and then I became one of our supervisors, our volunteer supervisors. And then when our founder was retiring, I was probably the most logical person to take the charity on. In the 4 years since I've taken us on, we've gone from strength to strength. We've got over 400% rise in new members and engaged members at our support groups. We do support groups, we do counselling, and we also do a lot supporting our members around hate crime. Back in 2007, 2008, the Equality Act was coming in. Chrysalis was asked to get involved with surveying their members then about the experiences of hate crime. And it was as a result of that survey where we found out that out of every single one of our members, they'd all experienced hate crime, transphobic hate crime, that we were able to feed that in to, which is why the police now have to report on transphobic hate crime as one of the 5 strands nationally. I'd love to sit here and say, that was 2008. We know a lot more about being trans now. It's got better. It hasn't. Almost every single one of our out members, new inquiries, has experienced transphobia. It's every single one. I've talked to people who say it's much easier to be out about being gay than they would ever be out about being trans. I've got people that tell me about having stuff thrown at them in the streets, about being threatened. They go for a takeaway at night and being told people like you shouldn't be alone at night. Getting called faggot when you're holding hands with your girlfriend. The implication being that you couldn't possibly have got her pregnant, that you're not a man. Have your path blocked when you're trying to leave a pub? People getting in your face, threatening you. And it goes on and on and on. And I think what Joe was just saying then about tolerance, we want acceptance, understanding, or just unremarkability. But we're asking for you a 0 tolerance for that kind of behaviour. We're here, we're looking at housing particularly. One of the things about being trans is there often isn't a safe space. And 41% of trans people are experiencing transphobia from family members. It happens in the home. And all of this takes its toll. It's great. It's absolutely brilliant to be trans right now because there is lots of other people. There's support, there's knowledge, there's understanding of gender euphoria, which is absolutely amazing. Because when it's right, it's perfect. We're moving past that medicalisation. But because the world is becoming harder, it's having a negative impact on our mental health. And Joe said bring stats, and I'm really sorry to start this with some really awful stats. But since I started at Chrysalis and we started capturing mental health statistics, we have seen a 30-40% rise in poor mental health of our new members. So when I started, it's around 45% of people said they experienced negative impacts on their mental health. For context, wider population, 25%. Now this year, 87% of our new members. So being trans, or the treatment that they receive because they're trans, has had a negative impact on their mental health. So yeah, I'm here. I hope I can be of use. Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Andi. I mean, we talk about stats. There's some other really frightening stats that have come out from things like the total job survey this year and trans people in employment. We look at the hate crime stats. I think, was it 1 in 5 LGBTQ plus people have experienced a hate crime in the last 12 months, but 2 in 5 trans people have experienced a hate crime. That's twice the average of the whole queer community. It's just trans people.
And
but
one in 4
is also
sorry,
people were underreporting. 4 out of 5 hate crimes do go unreported, especially amongst younger people. And those are the stats that we think we're actually not getting the full picture. So that we're more likely to be underreporting, seeing what's truly going on. And that's the danger we're hiding. We've got to encourage more reporting, because we know that the police are taking transphobic crimes more seriously, as they should be.
Yeah. All of those examples,
stats as well. Yeah.
All of those examples that I gave, they come up in our groups, in those safe spaces, that conversation. None of those people have taken us up on the support of reporting them. And yet the work we have done as an organisation with Hampshire Constabulary has significantly increased reporting. So yeah, it's the tip of the iceberg.
Because we know the stats. Yeah, homelessness is higher amongst trans and gender non-conforming people. We know that employment is lower statistically for trans and gender non-conforming people. We know that statistically employers overtly state they're less likely to hire people who are trans. I think it's 1 in 3 employers actively admitted they wouldn't hire somebody. That's not
people that would
the
admit
ones who just don't. Yes, they just want to admit it. And the other stat I always find quite a good balance is that 85% of people declared themselves as either trans positive or trans neutral. Kind of, we're okay, live, we're fine. And I think 85%, I mean, there are a percentage of the population that are anti this, anti that, radical this, far extreme on anything. So 50% of the population is probably about the number that is kind of out on the edge of society anyway. But there's still 15% of the population that are actively anti-trans. But it's the 15% that are making all the noise, all of the things we see in the paper, the mainstream media, etc. And that's what's causing people's mental health to suffer, isn't it, Andi?
Yeah. And that shout of transphobia that creates a culture where people feel free to do horrible stuff because they're not getting called out. And again, that comes back to that word, that's where the zero tolerance is. Call it out, it's not acceptable. Be that door staff who says, I heard what you said, that was wrong. You're not coming in this pub ever again. Thank you, goodbye. Because it happened, and that's amazing. That support, you get supported, and it's absolutely amazing.
But the other frightening thing is that not every hate crime is overt, and really there's a lot of microaggressions out there. Do you want to explain what a microaggression is and the impact that can have as well?
Yeah, a microaggression, it's a little picky pushy. It's a little thing like getting somebody's pronoun wrong and not apologizing. It's things like using sir or madam when actually you wouldn't normally, but using it to deliberately amplify the fact that you've read somebody as a different gender to the one that they're presenting as. It's telling people they can't use a public toilet. It's talking about us, exactly like you said at the beginning. It's having meetings talking about the trans issue without ever inviting a trans person into the space to say, well, what is your issue? Well, my main issue is people talking about me. Was that the kind of examples you're after?
When you say, when you talk about ladies and gentlemen, I hear it on station platform announcements all the time. And every time I hear someone use the phrase ladies and gentlemen, I think, how many non-binary people at that moment feel excluded and erased from that conversation?
I'd like to know how many cisgender people feel excluded from that population. Actually, Sarah, madam, ladies and gentlemen, my goodness, we're living in the 17th century. You know, ladies, gentlemen, and plebeians over there, please step forward. You're down in third class, okay? Don't argue.
Yes,
we've got jobs at the moment, and people are still saying sir or madam on their heading, on their covering letter. So just think, it's so easy to neutralize language, and it changes your thinking.
It does. Well, thanks, Andi. That's a great intro from you. Let me park you back into the into the cheap seats, and I'll bring Majojo up. 1 second. So I'll move you off the spotlight. Hello, Majojo. Welcome on board. Would you like to just introduce yourself to the audience and give us a bit of background about why you're here today? And over to you, and I'll be back in a minute.
Sure, thank you, Joe. So I'm Majojo Kuss. Contrary to your disclaimer before, Joe, I am no longer part of Expedia Group. This is how fast the world moves today. Business is business. But the reason I am here today is that for the past so many years, I have been involved in inclusion work, be it through my employment place, at the time Expedia Group, and previously other companies, but also, as you know, because this is how we met, through charity work, having been a trustee of a number of charities, as well as a volunteer. For example, right now I am a volunteer at the LGBT Foundation. And what I find is common to all organizations and all sectors of activity is that when it comes to transgender inclusion and tackling transphobia, the nature of the activity is completely irrelevant, because we're talking here about including people for who they are. We're not even talking about the broader LGBTQIA topic where sexual orientation could get involved. We are right now talking about including and accepting, embracing people purely for who they are. And for me, who in the world has the right to deny who I say I am? I am the only person who can say who I am. Nobody lives in my head. Nobody lives in my heart or my soul. And so I am the only person who can know that. And we live in a society where there is a tendency to speak for others, like both of you, Andi and Joe, mentioned just now, and make decisions for other people in their absence. But when you start engaging in conversation, when you open the communication, you find that the situation can change drastically and very quickly. The power of disclosure, the power of sharing, it trumps any hatred, it trumps any hate speech and any exclusionary views from that minority that is right now making a lot of noise. Like, for instance, for the past 9 years, I have been working in inclusion for Expedia Group. And as part of that activity, I was a name contact for colleagues who may need to speak. They may question their own gender, they may have a child or a partner or a friend who came out to them, or simply wanted to be educated. And they had that safe space to come and talk to me in confidentiality, so they could ask all the risky questions that they would not dare ask in a group. Because that communication channel was open and people came forth talking, not only did we find that there are way many more trans people than everybody was claiming there were around us, but also we found ourselves making allies, because inherently most people are good. Inherently most people want to do good and want to be there for each other. but in 90% of the time, when somebody misspeaks, it is out of a lack of information, lack of education, and awareness. And as soon as you start speaking in a very transparent and candid way about topics that can be at times hurtful, but also create incidents, as soon as you start educating people, the whole deal changes, the whole situation changes. I have sat in meetings where, having come out more than a year earlier on a group of maybe 15 people, somebody would accidentally, and I know it was an accident, accidentally misgender me. But because we'd started that process of educating people and creating allies in our community, before I even had the chance to react or say anything, another colleague bounced back and corrected them. I didn't even have to say anything. And this is the power of speaking up, sharing, and not being afraid of coming forth with questions. If you ask me a question that is inappropriate or a little bit too intrusive, I will simply tell you. Well, if you don't mind, this is personal, so I would rather keep it to myself. But I would rather somebody takes a chance to ask, because if they ask, is that they want to know, they want to understand better. So that would be my reason for being here.
Thank you. Jojo, my understanding is you identify as a trans masculine person, a trans man. So for those of you who are not sure, I identify as a trans woman. I've seen the world from two perspectives, and now you're seeing the world from two perspectives. What have you realized as a trans man seeing the world from a male perspective that you didn't see in your old life or your previous gender identity?
I think the most ironic way to put it is that transitioning made me a feminist, because before transition, I was always about equality and equity, but I didn't have that insight of people's behavior towards you based on your gender. Quite often, when somebody behaves to you in a non-equitable way, you don't notice it, because that's all you've known your entire life. Except when I started transitioning and my voice got deeper and my bone structure changed, and I started talking to people on meetings, for example, or face-to-face, that had not known me before, I noticed that their behavior was different from what it would have been prior to transition. Suddenly, people perceiving me as a man would stop interrupting me. What is that about? Suddenly, my opinion would be taken on board a lot quicker. Again, what is this about? In situations where I would have had previously to fight for my spot, to have a word in the conversation, suddenly people were almost waiting for me to speak up and sort of light up the way. And I'm not going to lie, it feels great, but I'm not about working towards privilege. I'm about working towards equity and equality. So automatically I would have to be a very strong feminist, because I have absolutely no intention of gaining privilege for my own benefit, whilst others are being penalized simply for who they are, for their gender. I simply did not realize it as starkly before transition. I thought this was just the way the world was and the way people addressed each other. But when you suddenly notice that people's behavior changes towards you just because of the gender they perceive you as, this is when you notice just how deep and serious the issue is.
Yeah. A lot of what we're talking about today around transphobia is predominantly aimed at trans feminine people. So as a trans masculine person, do you feel this onslaught? Do you feel this prejudice as well? Or are you kind of on the periphery being an ally to trans women?
No, you're on the money, Joe. You're completely on the money. And I would even say, as a trans man, besides the odd slipping up, misgendering, or lack of education, I don't really get hate speech. I don't really get hate crime. It's super rare. But I observe it towards trans women every single day. Trans women, and I would say gender fluid people are widely discredited, almost erased by this very small population of gender critical people that we mentioned before. And I don't quite understand why. I must be honest, I don't quite understand why this harassment towards trans women. Surely if the issue is with being transgender, then the attacks would be equal on all of us. But I do notice that whenever we talk, even when you mention to somebody that you're transgender, by default they will assume you're a trans woman, and then they will look at me and I can hear the mind ticking, thinking, they can't be a trans woman. Something doesn't add up here. But they don't think for a second of another scenario when you mention you're trans.
I mean, other times, I don't know whether you feel that people think that your transition was easier as a trans man, but you
gosh, yes,
a lot more complications. You have your own set of challenges as a trans man that maybe people aren't aware of.
The privileges, the privileges list goes on longer than my arm. Like, for instance, medically, there are the medical transition for a trans man is so much smoother. I started taking hormones only a few months ago and already my voice has dipped. I didn't do anything for it, it just happened. I get access to a number of procedures that trans women clearly should also have access to, but do not, right? We're thinking, for example, why on earth is top surgery not available on the NHS to trans women, where it is for trans men? What is this about? And the list goes on and on.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's been some great insights. I'll pop you back into the cheap seats and let me introduce Georgie. Right, where do I take the spotlight off? There you go. There we go. Oh, hello, Georgie. Welcome. Would you like to just take the floor for a minute and introduce yourself and tell us what your passions are?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Joanne. So hi, folks. My name is Georgie Williams. My pronouns are they, them. I am an academic specialist in the field of gender identity. I also do work in LGBTQ+ welfare. So I have a deferred PhD position at University College Dublin in the Department of Social Justice. I also completed an undergrad in psychology and a Masters of Science in gender at LSE. I have been an activist and public speaker in this field for a while now, and as part of my own freelance work, I established the /Queer Project, which is an educational platform and an oral histories archive of gender and sexuality diversity around the world. So this is predominantly disseminated through a podcast. In season 1, I traveled through the United States, I traveled through Japan, Indonesia, the United Kingdom, and Ireland, archiving gender and sexual history there. At this point, we have had engagement in 123 countries around the world, which is really exciting. And I'm also looking to do season 2 through mainland Europe next year as well. The intention basically was to take gender and sexual history, which is usually relegated to the very expensive lecture halls of universities, and put it in a public forum. because I ultimately believe that our understanding of gender and sexuality should be accessible to everybody. I take umbrage with activism becoming ultimately a middle-class hobby. And I think that the discourse, particularly around trans issues, would be so much more enlightened if we all had access to the same tools. So that's kind of what I do. I speak not only as an academic within this field and an activist, but I am also non-binary. So I don't identify as male, I don't identify as female, and that very much feeds into the work that I do. So as a researcher, I sometimes do talk from my own standpoint. I talk from my own lived experience about my experiences of navigating gendered spaces, navigating things like my own dysphoria, but I also try and take a decolonial approach to my research. And what that means is trying to decenter myself as a voice within the stories that I tell, especially through my project /queer, and make sure that these histories are being recorded and these stories are being told by the people that they belong to. Because I think there is an issue of intersectionality as well at the core of the trans rights movement, where ultimately a lot of the language that we use comes from the West as well. And gender variance is a global phenomenon. It presents itself in communities all around the world. And so something I very much want to encourage as well is consciousness around the language that we use and the assumptions that we make about different communities, because ultimately gender diversity is everywhere. So when we talk about trans inclusion, we're not just talking about gender or even sexuality as an additional aspect of it. We're also talking about race, we're talking about socioeconomic status, we're talking about culture. So yeah, I very much try to bring an intersectional approach to the work that I do. I think that's the gist of it, as far as I can remember from what I've done so far.
Thanks, Georgie. As you're speaking now, I think we've spoken a lot in the past about your /queer project. What have you learned from the different communities around the world? Because if you listen to the voice in the mainstream media, this seems to be some kind of Twitter internet phenomenon where trans people have suddenly sprang out of existence where they would never exist before. So your research must have shown insight into communities that haven't been touched by the internet.
Well, yes and no. The world would be a better place if they hadn't been touched by the internet, is what I will say. There are communities who, yet their presentation of gender diversity existed long before our rudimentary Western understanding of transgender ever did. So a good example of community that I worked with when I was in Indonesia, I worked with some individuals who are Bugis. Bugis is an ethnic community in Indonesia who traditionally have recognized a 5-gender, 3-sex social system. So to kind of break that down as much as possible in terms of 3 sexes, they recognize male, female, but they do also recognize intersex, which obviously accounts for 1 in 100 of global population, 1.7% of us aren't biologically quote unquote male or female. So they recognize that, but they also recognize 5 gender identities. 2 of which, Makundra and Orane, kind of like our Western ideas of cisgender men and women, but obviously their ideas of what's male and female are a little different in Indonesia as well. Then we have Chalalai and Chalabai, which our closest equivalent would be kind of like trans feminine and trans masculine, but it's more about presenting androgynously. And then they have Bisu as well. And Bisu are considered, I believe the term that was used to describe it to me is metagender. They're actually considered above gender and are the people you want to go to for advice and support within the community because they're considered to not have a gender bias. And this is not some tiny little village in a corner of Indonesia. The Bisu, well, not the Bisu, the Bugis are 6 million Indonesian citizens. So a huge community in the 20th largest economic power in the world. And arguably the only issue that they've really had in terms of kind of Western influence from the internet is the importing of transphobia. So the Bugis community was long respected, and the issue that they have now is first and foremost colonization. The colonization of their country by the Dutch impacted the way that gender was perceived and what was normalized and enforced. But also secondly, globalization has meant that transphobic media has made its way to Indonesia. And so people that indigenously were what we would consider gender diverse are now being ostracized and socially excluded for this. And that's just one of many examples. There's other parts of Indonesia that also have third genders. We've seen a little bit of this in Japan as well, but this presents in many communities. There are so many Northern African communities that traditionally had this gender diversity, lost it under colonialism because it was considered atavistic or uncivilized based on Western ideals. And so what I would say is that from what I found in my research, and so far I haven't gotten to all the communities I wanted to on the podcast yet because funding's a nightmare for something like this, but there are so many communities where the gender binary as we know it was exported. It isn't what is their norm. So it's not a norm within the human condition either. Our ideas are constrained not only by the geographical place that we're in, but also the time period that we live in as well. Our ideas about a gender binary are actually pretty new if we look at the extent of human history.
Yes, I mean, I've listened to some of the new episodes and absolutely fascinating. So I would encourage anyone who's here today to seek out the Slash Queer podcast. Another question I have for you is, people often confuse expression and identity. And they see someone who's transmasculine, they expect that person to look like a man. And when they see a transfeminine person, they expect that person to look like a female. How do you look non-binary? That really confuses people, doesn't it?
I'm so glad you asked this question, Joe, because it gets my goat. So the issue is here that our ideas of what looks male and female, once again, are culture bound. Because if we think about it, in many Middle Eastern countries, men wear what we would consider to be dresses. You know, we have examples of this all around the world. And I would say as well, our ideas about masculinity and femininity are also grounded in colonial beliefs and ultimately racism. If we think about how body hair is treated on particularly women of color, that it's seen as inherently masculine. And so our ideas about what is supposed to look masculine and feminine are highly reductive, but also they're socially constructed. And that means that those aren't kind of inherent rules that we have to follow. And I would say as somebody who's non-binary, you know, I was assigned female at birth. I do not identify as female. However, there are aspects of femininity that I do enjoy and I do appreciate. And I have said to people before that if I was assigned male at birth, I would be wearing the same clothes. I would still be wearing makeup. But arguably, I guess on a biological level, I would feel like my sense of androgyny that I have internally might be expressed more. And there's many reasons why a non-binary person might not be visibly non-binary, whatever that's supposed to look like, because there really are no rules. But it can be first and foremost that an individual cannot safely come out. And this applies for the entirety of the trans community, binary and non-binary. Not everybody's in a safe environment where they can make their transness visible in some way. Secondly, you might have other medical reasons that mean that you can't go through transitional therapies, be it hormone replacement therapy or transitional surgeries. Thirdly, you may not even experience gender dysphoria. You may not feel a disconnect between your outward appearance and your internal sense of identity. And so appearing something other than somebody who has cis-assuming privilege may not be something that that person wants to do. Speaking from a personal standpoint, if I could, as I always call it, fantasy football transition and wake up tomorrow looking exactly how I want to look, I would be a lot taller. My body would be a lot more androgynous. I may have some kind of bottom growth from, you know, something like testosterone. I would have the best beard you've ever seen in your life. But I would still keep aspects of how I dress, how I do my makeup. I wouldn't want my body to appear just like a cisgendered man does. And what I will say is that's a huge amount of personal information to share about myself as well in justifying why I appear to many people to be a cis woman. And so it's something I would encourage people to consider when they ask these questions, that ultimately there may be a lot of people in your life that are non-binary that don't want to disclose very personal information as to why they're not readable as non-binary to you. So non-binary doesn't necessarily look like one thing, because our ideas of what gender look like vary hugely based, again, on time and space. But also it's a very personal thing, and different people have different ways of expressing their gender identity.
Absolutely fantastic. I've seen some of your tweets about your desire to have a beard. I think that it's really interesting to listen to some of your follow some of those tweets. Yes, so no, absolutely superb. Thank you for that introduction. Let me bring our other panelists back from the cheap seats and we'll add them into the spotlight. Here we go. Welcome back. Here we all are. So I've got a few questions. There has been one question from the audience so far, so please keep them coming. If you're sat in the audience, please either use the Q&A. In fact, the Q&A is probably the best way of doing this, so it doesn't get lost in the chat. Someone's asked, I think it's directed to Andi, because I think this came up when you were speaking. What should people use instead of ladies and gentlemen, sir, madam? What is a good way of removing the gender from conversation in that way?
I like hello, good afternoon, good evening, welcome. I was talking about this with someone else. If you're standing up to give a speech, then people know that you're addressing them. So generally that suffices. If you're writing a formal letter to whom it may concern, it's just simple. This stuff already exists. We were talking about gender neutral language the other day. It's like, oh my God, I can't, how can I, sorry, doorbell, typical. How can I possibly cope with the young people at my school, and I can't use sons and daughters or boys and girls. What about child or young people? You know, the gender neutral language is typically already there. So that was kind of like a bit of an expanded answer, but yeah, hello works quite well.
Yeah, just move the full stop, a word in. Hello, drop the sir, just hello. Hello, how are you? Would you like a table? Great to see you. Fantastic. Georgie, did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, and I can't take credit for this because I saw somebody else talking about this on Twitter, but they were saying use the thing that the person's doing. So if you have a group of people today, you say welcome esteemed guests, attendees. If it is, you know, when you're waiting for the train, it could be dear customers. Use the thing that the people are doing to bring them together as a group, because usually we don't tend to gender our verbs like that. So it can be the thing that the people are doing instead to be inclusive. So yeah, once again, if you're talking about children at school, it can be students as well, because that's the thing that they are. So it's quite versatile. The gendered language is a very strange, antiquated formality that we have that actually I don't think is really relevant anymore, in the same way that we have a lot of kind of gendered honorifics that seem just very old-fashioned and out of touch of where we're at this day and age.
Mm-hmm. And frankly, when you're addressing a crowd, hello everyone works just fine.
Yeah. Oh, I like to create new collective nouns like hello conferencees or hello space cadets or something. Just kind of, I think every organization has a kind of a name for itself. So just hello us and whatever that may be. And I think we can make it friendly. We can make it inclusive by degendering where we don't need gender, where gender is irrelevant. Where, as we know, gender is often irrelevant. It shouldn't matter when we're addressing people, involving people, including people. So yeah, no, I think there's some great suggestions there. Okay, the reason we're here really is to tackle the intolerance that we've talked about, to let's get really down into the transphobia that exists in society today. Let me ask a question here. So and I'm sure you all experience or see comments in the media on a daily basis, you know, whether it's the red tops, the broadsheets, or the new the new format Times and Telegraph, and we're seeing it in those kind of print media, the traditional media. We're seeing it in Twitter. We're seeing in news debates. We've seen the BBC have some issues. So what's going on, Andi? What's going on in society at the moment? Where's this come from?
Where's it come from? that's probably a bigger question than I can answer. But I think what it's generating is a change in language. So it's a normalization of transphobic language. It's a normalization of things like biological sex, when actually that's a made-up term that we've got a language. We just talked about it. So the WHO defines being gender diverse, being trans, as your gender identity is not in alignment with that which you were assigned at birth. We have the language, it's out there. But what we're seeing is this insidious little nibbly ways that trans people are trying to say, excuse me, could you let us in? We'd like to be included, please. To twist it and turn it and take it away. I think to look at particularly the BBC, they're in the news at the moment. I've always been a staunch defender of the BBC. I think a national broadcaster that theoretically has everybody's interests at heart. So I think that that's a great thing. I've been really disheartened over the last few years to watch a small voice of criticism and of attack towards trans people get amplified and amplified and amplified until that appears to be the stance of our national broadcaster. And there is, again, we were talking right at the beginning about no conversations without us. And actually all of this has happened without us. So we've said, excuse me, I hope you don't mind. I'm a polite British person. It would be really nice for me and my mental well-being if you would kindly use my pronouns. I'd really prefer it if you could use my pronouns. Oh, you prefer those pronouns, do you? Oh, it's a preference, it's not real. No, I'm polite. But you take it, you twist it, you turn it over. I can't tell you why. I could speculate. Living on the edge, you and I, Jay, we've talked about this before, it gives you a view of the middle. And maybe there is that fear of people who challenge, people who live on the edge, people who see more. I don't know, that's speculation. All I can really say is it hurts. It hurts and it's killing people. Being trans isn't a mental health issue. Being trans doesn't mean you'll have mental health problems, but constant denial, discrimination, abuse, and hate will kill you. We've got more names for Trans Day of Remembrance this year than we've ever had before. In 5 years, there's been a 350% rise in transphobia in the UK alone. And our national broadcaster and the platforming that we give to people who spout constant abuse and who challenge the absolute existence of gender diversity for whatever reasons. And I could cite faith, but I don't think faith is the only reason. And I know some incredible people of faith who are incredible allies and indeed who are gender diverse themselves. So I don't think that that's a simple and easy answer.
Georgie, how do we balance free speech and discourse in today's society whilst deplatforming intolerance?
A great question. And I think if I had the right answer, I would be a very rich person. What I will say is, and I'm going to come back to intersectionality actually for this. Intersectionality, for people that aren't fully aware of that term or maybe are unfamiliar with it, is the idea that different people have different lived experiences, and you can't kind of add them and subtract them together to determine, you know, who's more privileged or who's less privileged. So for example, you could be a trans woman of color, right? And there's multiple things that intersect there, right? First and foremost, you are a woman, you're also trans, you're also a person of color, right? And so these are all things that intersect with each other and overlap. I've talked before about, like, so for example, if a woman of color was a woman and a person of color, it's not blue plus red intersecting, it's purple, right? It's that unique lived experience in the middle. And that unique lived experience means that you can talk to a certain extent for the people within your community, but you can't talk to everybody. And you can't talk for those kind of distinct groups necessarily. And so I think the problem is largely that we still in society think that one person can talk for an entire group, right? Or they can talk for other groups that aren't being represented. And Joe, I know you and I have talked before about, panels where, there's a bunch of cis people talking about the trans debate, quote unquote. And the issue is that there is, of course, free speech, absolutely, in this country. We're very lucky that exists, but there's a difference between free speech and hate speech. At the end of the day, of course, you're entitled to your opinion, but if your opinion propagates and encourages violence, structural violence, aggression towards a minority group, you should expect there to be repercussions. There should be consequences for inciting violence. And so I think there's a big issue with the fact that people think that free speech means that you can dehumanize a group. That's not how it works. And we see this time and time again with these gender critical individuals or trans exclusionary radical feminists who think that they are doing the right thing by often standing up for women's rights against the trans community. And actually what they are doing is they are saying, no, we are people and these individuals are not. And so there's a problem with the fact that the dialogue is hugely swayed in favor of them. We see it through the algorithms in social media, that so often trans individuals are penalized just for defending themselves online against people who are basically saying, I'm going to argue you out of existence. And I'm thinking now about a fantastic article, and I can't remember the name of the author, but it's called Chav Mum Chav Scum. And it was originally used to critique the language that's been used to dehumanize working class individuals in the UK, arguing that you can kind of almost mock and belittle these people out of existence. And the problem is that the same thing arguably is happening with the trans community. Trans people are trying to fight back and say, actually, no, I deserve to be visible. I deserve to be treated as your equal, which actually is the bare minimum that any of us deserve. And in doing so, in pushing back, that's seen as aggression, because a lot of the time, the transphobia that we see that's being touted as free speech is kind of done with this supposed humorous edge where people are saying, oh, well, I'm just joking, obviously. Because, the trans community has long needed to be brought down a peg or two, apparently. And then pushing back against that, you're seen as the individual who is being aggressive. And so I think there's a problem with first and foremost, the inequality that's demonstrated in the panels that have conversations about these things. Also, secondly, how algorithms are designed on social media to platform particular voices, to encourage, if you're on YouTube and you search anything to do with trans people, to encourage you going down a pipeline of far-right propaganda. And so I think it's not just about human discussions, it's also about how virtual spaces are being programmed to minimize trans voices.
Yeah, I see a lot of discussion where people, they feel like they're losing something. People of privilege feel that they're having their privilege erased. So when we talk about creating gender neutral facilities, space where all people can access swimming and other sport, suddenly people feel that their right of access is being lost. Someone's taking away their female only space. What we're trying to do is create accessible spaces for all, not trying to erase something. I think it's the pizza or the pie argument, isn't it? We think we're losing a bit of pizza by sharing it. What we're actually doing is we have infinite pizzas. We can just make the pizza bigger and include more people. Yeah. Majojo, did you have any thoughts on that?
I found what you just said, Georgie, really interesting, because that's yet another example of where gender privilege shows its ugly nose. We sort of experimented just recently with a few friends where we reported transphobic comments and hate speech on Twitter, right? Except the response from Twitter was different depending on who was reporting it. So when my trans feminine friends would report a transphobe, the response would come back really quickly. Oh, Twitter, you're so efficient. except the response was, oh, we found from our investigation, they did not violate the rules. If I reported the exact same comment by the exact same person from my account, I show as a male, right? It would take a little longer for Twitter to get back to me. However, they found suddenly from their investigation that they did violate the rules. Same comments, same profile, same everything. The only difference being who reported it.
Let's let that sink in for a second. So there is bias in the algorithms as well.
There's bias in the teams that are investigating the reports at the other end.
Yeah. I've reported things on LinkedIn, I've reported things on Twitter and Facebook, and I've had very similar responses. It doesn't violate. And there's
I rest my case.
How much more does it have to be before it can be considered a violation? And that's the challenge, isn't it? And that, a lot of this stuff is really, really triggering. Yeah, Andi, sorry.
Yeah, no, and that is the environment that trans people are living in all day, every day. You see a transphobic comment, you see your friends try to counter it. And because your friends counter it or challenge it, oh my God, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger because it's never moderated out. So it becomes this welter of constant feelings of being abused, of being discrimination, of being shut down, of being hidden, ignored, spoken about, and so on and so forth. And again, that is the point when it becomes internalized. The Gallup survey that came out earlier this year, from which I've quoted some of the stats, it's like there's somebody on there who says, how can this not affect me? How can this not have an impact on my mental health? Because it's every aspect of my being. I try to be a normal human in a normal world, and I'm listening to all of you, and you clearly spend more time on social media and interacting in more spaces. I don't have that resilience. I have to run my charity. I need to keep myself safe so that I can support my hundreds of people that need support. And it's just exhausting, absolutely exhausting.
We know that the hate is a minority of people. We know that it's getting a disproportionate amplification through high profile. We have people who are police and county crime commissioners, we have members of parliament, we have people in the House of Lords, we have well-known published authors, TV producers, editors of mainstream media. So we have a lot of amplification, a well-funded and well-coordinated letter writing campaign is going on out there. But the reality day to day for trans people, if we could turn the dial down on that noise, society is, I think society is fantastic. You know, I live a very happy, productive life. Okay, I may be privileged in that because I am not affected day to day by vast amounts of transphobia. But the life for most out and open and productive trans people is fairly positive. Is it not? I mean, we're all relatively happy human beings, I believe.
I would agree with you only to some extent, Joe, because yes, they are a minority, and yes, we know they are excessively amplified. However, I found this whole phenomenon very worrying. It really, really concerns me because the approach they're taking is very uncomfortably similar to what we would have observed back in the 40s with the Nazi movements, for example. They manipulate part of the population that do not have access to sufficient education and awareness to get them to rally around them. They manipulate opinions, they manipulate people's behavior and spread hatred that way. And that sort of behavior, unless it is tackled in a serious manner by the people who've got the power to do so, could very quickly escalate out of control. And I personally find it very concerning. no matter how small that group is.
I think it also gets
It's the rise of
internal.
intolerance. Yeah, it's a rise of intolerance, isn't it? It's we're trying to platform everybody and giving free speech, which leads to the rise of extremes, and that's the challenge we've got to counteract, isn't it?
Free speech unless you're transgender. Don't forget.
Andi.
Yeah, it gets into. I know it gets internalized, and that then becomes internalized transphobia, which makes it even harder to be authentic. I could sit here and talk about gender euphoria all day. It's absolutely amazing to be authentic. But when outside and inside prevent you from experiencing that, that makes you then more vulnerable. Jo, you've got a huge amount of strength. And we've talked before about, how you manage your space in the world and everything else. And that comes with being euphoric. That comes with being authentic, being affirmed, being supported and growing and developing. But the bit inside, if it doesn't get that chance, again, becomes more vulnerable. And I'm absolutely agreeing with Majojo here that it's concerted and it is making the environment much, much worse.
Georgie, did you want to chip in there as well?
I just wanted to add a little bit to say that I appreciated your point, Majojo, because I think people think sometimes that's an exaggeration when you compare this to kind of, what happened in the 40s with the Nazis. But actually that was a trans issue as well, because, and I'm thinking now of the Institute of the Sexual Wissenschaft, which was in Berlin, which I think started in the 1920s, which was a sexual research institute run predominantly, almost exclusively by openly transgender individuals who were esteemed scientists, respected within the community, who were doing fantastic research into trans experience, into gender diverse experiences. And that entire archive of research was lost in the Nazi book burnings, and it set back the trans movement by decades. And so I think people sometimes think that we're exaggerating how bad it is and how long we've been discriminated against, but this history goes back a long way. And it is a small group ultimately, but I do think that the visibility of that small group normalizes particular things. Like I have like a small amount of facial hair, and if I like tint my mustache hair and walk down the street to go get some milk, you can bet that the people that were originally catcalling me in the street are now jeering, they're making aggressive comments. And that's normalized because of the fact that there are so many people that wouldn't call themselves actively transphobic, but it's the same with racism, where you are either racist or you are anti-racist, right? So you are either transphobic or you are anti-transphobic. You are either the person that's going to stand up and say something when I'm being harassed in the street to the people that are harassing me, or is going to video something in case like something happens and I'm not safe, or you're compliant in that happening. And so I think it's something we need to take a stronger stance on sometimes and say, you're either with us or you're against us, and you can't be in the middle. You can't be trans neutral,
Amen to that.
And people may look at me, who know me may believe I'm robust, strong, resilient, lots of bounce back ability. And yes, like anybody, I have that character trait, but my armor is only 1 mil thick, and it doesn't take much to penetrate my armor. And simple things like buying an ice cream and being handed the ice cream, here you go, mate. It's like that. I'll talk about that for donkey's years. And the Amazon delivery person that arrives on my doorstep and misgenders me on my own doorstep, almost inviting them into my house, that stands for me for weeks. And even yesterday, I had a situation where someone was trying to justify the professor who recently resigned from a university, their victimhood, and that sent me into a spiral. I was physically shaking and felt physically sick as a result of that conversation with a person I thought was a friend and ally. So yes, people's allyship has to be absolute. We have to understand and think about the debate that's at hand here and not just be superficial about it. So yeah, it's
Mm.
even robust trans people, as I say, our armor is only a mil thick as well. You know, we are soft on the inside, very soft on the inside. So yeah, it's,
Exactly so. I mean, you know me, Joe, by now. I'm not exactly frail and fragile, right? And I would see myself as a very resilient person. But the impact of these tiny little things that add up throughout the day to our mental health is very real. Just recently, I'm sure you've heard my accent by now. English is my third language. And just recently, I went to visit my family who live in France. And I was only there for 2.5 days. But it was 2.5 days of being constantly misgendered everywhere I went. Not by my family. Fortunately, I have the best family in the world. But by everybody else, those strangers that theoretically mean nothing to my life, except when I've spent an entire day being called madam. And on top of that, people disrespecting my disability and treating me with nothing but disdain because I could not hear them behind their mask. I'm sorry that I'm deaf. And they would not reply, they would not repeat what it said. They would let my mom repeat louder for me, all the while misgendering me. I had 2.5 days of this. And when I came back to Manchester, it was like, finally, I'm safe again.
okay. So we've had a question come in from the audience, which I think we'll take at this time. So here, so given what we've just been talking about, how can individuals and organizations, I think we have to see, there's the personal side, what can I do? And what can we do as an organization to tackle transphobic behavior? How can people be a better ally and stand up? Who wants to kick off for that one?
Well, first and foremost, challenge transphobic behavior when you see it. Trans people shouldn't have to constantly defend themselves. It's exhausting. And what people often don't understand about even microaggressions is that they're cumulative, right? First few times you hear something, you can probably handle it. 200, 300 times in, you're exhausted. You know, you don't want to have to keep fighting for yourself. So stick up for other people, first and foremost. I would say as well, think about the language that you use, keep it as neutral as possible. Because that, I mean, I keep my pronouns in my Zoom at work all of the time. But the thing that I love is the number of my cisgender colleagues that do it too. So that those of us that have our pronouns in our bio, we aren't necessarily outing ourselves as trans because it's just the practice at the workplace. I think that's really useful. Gender neutral bathrooms in offices as well, super important. And people don't sometimes understand why. And I think often about trans men and trans masculine individuals who may need a disposal bin for sanitary products, which most men's bathrooms don't have. So having those neutral spaces, really, really important. And what I would say as well is be conscientious of the experience of those who are transitioning. It can be really intense on the body and on the mind. And I think that's justification a lot of the time for things like sick leave as well. You know, making sure that you can deal with those particularly intense periods. And especially as well, you know, if an individual's going through some kind of transitional surgery too, making sure that they're going to be able to take that time, take that leave, in the way that many individuals, many cisgender individuals will get that support for other forms of life-saving surgery, because trans surgeries are life-saving at the end of the day. So yeah, I think there's a lot that can be done, but I say first and foremost, be the person that's kind of advocating for these things so that trans people don't have to. Absolutely refer back to them if you're unclear on things, because it's, you know, not that we want you to speak on behalf of us all the time, but it's important that trans people don't feel like they're the ones that have to stick up for themselves all the time. If somebody says something inappropriate, or if somebody, you know, misgenders a trans person in the workplace, be the person to call them out. Because it's like any other social movement where, I'm thinking now of feminism, where sometimes there are men who will only listen to other men about things like feminism. They won't listen to women. And it's like with race. where there's white people that are only going to learn by listening to other white people. You can be that cisgender person that other cisgender people will listen to so that they understand what this movement's about.
Thank you. Andy, did you want to chip in with any tips?
Yeah, what you were saying about pronouns, absolutely. The more people that own their gender identity, the better. Be proud of who you are. Everybody should be proud of, if you've taken the time to explore and gone, you know what, I'm in alignment. That's bloody awesome, isn't it? You live in gender euphoria too. So take it, own it. Be proud to be cis. Introduce yourself as cisgender. Let's claim that word back. Claim it for the nice people, and it removes the antagonism from it. I've actually been in several situations where people have been introducing themselves and gender identity has been relevant, and the cis people have introduced themselves as cis first before any trans person has done so. And it's just like, wow, this is totally a safe space. I love safe spaces. You make them by making them bigger, but you can make the safest space within your workplace. You can be the most rainbow workplace ever. You have to remember that your staff leave that space, and you don't know, unless you've taken time to find out, what they're going out into. They could be going out into the street. They could be, again, thinking a particular example from a housing association. One of your team is going out and visiting properties. Are they getting transphobic abuse in those properties? Are they safe outside of your embassy? What about at home? Are they able to be out at home? Are they only safe at work? Are they getting changed in the car park so that nobody knows at home? Those things you won't know unless you ask. You need a transition at work policy. Everybody should have one. Until you start looking, you won't know which documentation you need as an organisation to change. And I know Joe would help. We're always available for information on things like that as well. But just start thinking about it and hosting more events like this, talking about it, talk about transphobia and what you're going to do to challenge it.
But Jojo, have you got a top tip there?
I would agree wholeheartedly with both of you, Georgie and Andi. And I would just add, if you're already an ally, if you've already made the effort to educate yourself, be vocal about it. Be very vocal about it, because the positive will attract the positive. You will lead by example.
A top tip I always give to people is you have a microsecond to react in a positive way when someone tells you they're trans. So how do you imagine you're going to react when someone says, can I sit down and have a conversation? And the conversation is, I want to tell you that I'm trans and I want to transition at work. You've got a microsecond to react in a positive way. If you don't feel confident that you can give that affirmative, supportive, how can I help message in that moment, now is the time to start thinking about and practicing how you're going to react. To me, I would say it should be no different to I'm having a baby. And okay, for me, that would be a miracle, but it should be no different. We should have that euphoric, amazing, oh, wow, take a seat, let's talk about it. What are you thinking? How can I help? What can I do next? So the process is well trodden. When someone says, I'm trans, I want to transition, the reaction should be, sit down, how can I help? What can I do for you to make this go right? So if you're not having that thought already, if you've got an oh my God moment, quick grab the phone HR, what do I do now? Now's the time to start thinking about that. Make sure it's embedded in yours and your work colleagues so that everybody treats this as a kind of a celebration, not a shock and an OMG. So those are the kind of things I would say, the preparation. And if anyone ever says to me, we don't employ gay people, we've got no trans people working here, then statistically 1% of your population, whether that's its staff, your residents, your tenants, will identify as gender diverse in some respect. or at least intersex people will be at least 1% of your population as well. So think about the fact that you may not have visibility. If you haven't got visibility, what does that say about your culture? What does that say about people's trust in your organization? So look at the reporting. If you're underreporting trans, gender diverse, LGBTQ plus people, there could be a trust element here that we've got to address first. So think about those things. But yeah, proactiveness is my key top tip, if you like, on that. Well, we've got a couple of other questions here coming in from the audience, which is fantastic. So keep them coming. Who wants to pick this one up? The question is, what are some of the official records that trans people have to change? You know, should we call it the legal transition? What are the key elements of a legal transition that people change?
All of them.
Jojo, do you want to? Yeah. Well, Jojo, you're doing this at the moment. Do you want to
I'm
talk
going
about
through that right now. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's quite an adventure. It's quite an adventure. All of them, and that is maybe something where organizations can help, because quite often you find yourself not being able to update a specific record because it has a dependency to another record, but that other record requires something else, and so on and so forth. So, like, for instance, my landlord was absolutely amazing about updating my name. And I asked him, I said, well, do you not mind that my passport will not yet be updated because I'm a French national? So it's currently being thought about by the French administration people, right? It could be 2 months, it could be 2 years, who knows? And he said to me, well, no, you say you are who you tell me you are. So I would rather be respectful, and I would rather you feel safe in your own home and feel that it truly is your home because it is rented in your correct name. And what should I care whether your passport is not matching your other depot? So a little bit of flexibility can change the entire deal. Like, I spoke to my bank recently, and I said to my bank, I'm really sorry, but to update my name, you're asking me to come in person into the branch. You've closed all your branches. There's one left. I can't really come between 9 and 4 into the one branch that is still open whilst I'm working. That's not going to happen. Again, a little bit of flexibility. Let me speak to your manager. Okay, let's work it out this way. And they worked out an alternative. There isn't officially an alternative, but they worked one out for me because they took into account the reality of we've all got a life and processes are great. Don't take me wrong, I'm a program manager, so I love processes. Everything is a process, but quite often you need to work around the process too. And so showing understanding, being a listener, and taking into account all of the factors that play into the situation, so you can work out the best solution for that particular situation, even if it means you have to show some flexibility, can go a very long way.
Let me just chip in on a housing kind of specific query. I helped a housing association the other week. The quandary they had was they had a trans woman who was at the stage of their transition where she hadn't yet updated her identity in terms of driving license or passport, and didn't have any utility bills in her name. So the housing association was struggling because a legal document to sign the lease, to legally acquire that property, there has to be currently safeguarding, money laundering, right of residency, and the only residency and information this person could provide was the passport in their birth assigned gender and name. And that was a real challenge. And I mean, the advice I gave at the time was sit down with the person, have a conversation, explain why there's a legal need to have some information recorded. Look at how you can respect that person's privacy, limit who has exposure to that information. Consider having a known as field explicitly throughout the document that they're signing, and then maybe have one tiny box in the middle of nowhere that says, my passport is in this name, which is kind of factual. It doesn't erase their identity. It's almost like a fact. I'm signing that my passport is me kind of box. And so it's about having that adaptability and being willing to engage with trans people where they're not in this binary fixed state. They're in this state of flux at a vulnerable time in their life. This person, marriage had broken down. They were looking for social housing to tide them over. So they're very vulnerable. They were either housed by the housing association or face homelessness. So how can you engage in a very person-centric way and not be governed by GDPR or rules, or this is the way we have to do it, this is what legal says? So I'd say go that extra mile and think about how you can be supportive. Andi, do you want to chip in with that?
I was just thinking about that term preferred name. And because I like to think about inclusion being for everybody rather than just for one aspect. And names are incredibly culturally specific. A lot of certainly the older IT systems had very anglicized naming convention, and this is your field for this. Asking anybody on their paperwork, what would you like me to call you, opens up a whole conversation of vastly improved customer relations. And then you can put all of that private stuff into that sealed box of need to know. I think one of the key things we'd say is remember the Data Protection Act. Don't capture it unless you need to. And nobody's gender identity should be a matter of gossip. Don't let it out. It doesn't need to be. And if you normalize using preferred name, because somebody may prefer to be Mrs. Smith and somebody else may be Felicity Florabelle, as long as you've got that and your team normalizes always calling people by what we know is respectful, then everything else just sits there in the legal, if we absolutely have to have it box.
Georgie, were you going to say something?
Can find a way to unmute myself. I think pretty much everything's been covered quite comprehensively by Andi and Majojo, but I would say as well that I think we need to approach names as something that's a little less, and maybe the word that I'm looking for isn't serious, but formal. So give people an opportunity to play around with names. I know a lot of trans people who try out a name to figure out if it works for them and then go, I don't think it does, but I've started using this name, and now if I change it again, there's going to be a whole big deal with it. You know, I actually have a colleague who, I don't know what their gender identity is, but they use all pronouns. And they go by actually 3 different names. One being the name they were given at birth, one which is an abbreviation, and one which is a more feminine version of the name that they were given at birth traditionally. And they go by all of them. And it's nice actually to give them the opportunity to kind of just explore what works for them and what suits them. And so I would say, you know, if a trans person kind of wants to change a name specifically that they're using in the workplace as well, I think we need to give people opportunities to say, yes, this is what I'm going by. I might stick with it, but it might change. And there shouldn't be a whole fanfare around that. And it shouldn't be considered a big deal either, nor is it representative of that individual not really being committed to their identity. You know, cis people tend to just grow up and accept a name that was given to them by their parents, and they don't really question whether or not it suits them or expresses who they are. That's something that trans people have to figure out on their own. It can take some time. It doesn't mean that person's any less trans or any less sure of who they are. They're just trying on a shoe to see what fits.
And we never question a Stephen who is known as Steve, a Chris DeVoe who's known as Chris, or I've got many friends and people in my network who use their middle name. No one ever bats an eyelid. They just put that on their documents and no one ever said anything. But suddenly when someone is trans or non-binary or gender diverse, suddenly it becomes like a process, whereas we normally take everybody at face value anyway. So yeah, just think about how you can be flexible and accommodating. Let me pick up on one other thing we talked about earlier around education. So we've got to think about, you know, when we're talking about in the housing context, we've got not only the education for the staff interactions, we've also got to think about our customers, our care and service users. When you're putting service into a person's home? Are you training your field people, your techs, the people who are doing the gas boiler servicing? When that person opens the door, are your people competent to understand the needs of trans individuals? Do they understand the language? Do they understand how to politely address? Are they have the emotional intelligence to be able to connect and speak to people as they wish to be spoken to? So again, don't just think about your head office staff. Think about the people who are going out in the field. Make sure they have the tools, because often they're just winging it and see what happens, and they hopefully don't get it wrong. So invest time in making sure all of your people, and we're not just talking about e-learning, tick box, EDI training here. We're talking about proper, immersive, lived experience type education, where people can ask questions and dive in. A bit like the one I've got here, which is something I said earlier about this person calls everybody mate. What should we be using instead? Well, I know many women and men who detest being called mate. So if we assume that word is problematic for some, so by keep using a word that you understand is problematic, is likely to lead to problems. So if you can accept that you may think it's okay, and a lot of people you may know think it's okay, but that means there are other people who are going to trip up with. And we have, we use honey, love, duck, hen, very colloquial terms, very regional, and we mean them with signs of affection. But you can create an exclusionary environment where people from outside of your locale, your town, don't use those phrases. Maybe your customers don't use those phrases. So again, you're creating an exclusionary language where you may be triggering people, making people feel uncomfortable. So try and stick to something easier. I mean, don't call me mate, call me Joe, or call me, or just thank you. Just thank you. Here are your ice creams. Thanks. Have a great day. So yeah, try and avoid these friendly terms, because these friendly terms can be microaggressions. We're getting close to the end here. So I think we've got time for a top tip or a last thought from each of our panelists here. Our excellent panelists. So I'm going to start with Georgie, because you're at my top left. So Georgie, what do you want to leave the audience with?
Ooh, that's a great question. I think what I want to leave the audience with is a desire to have dialogues about this. Because, and I think this is kind of a British thing as well, there's an awkwardness around having conversations about things we don't know, right? And I would say this doesn't mean necessarily asking trans people probing questions, but asking somebody about their lived experience. If they're talking about an aspect of being trans, go, what's that like? Can you tell me more? Or like being honest and saying, you know what, actually, I don't know how to approach this thing, or I don't know what to say in this situation. And like, what's the best thing that I can do? When I lecture on this subject, I tend to tell people to apply ask etiquette, actually, which means try and avoid making assumptions about anything, particularly when it comes to something like pronouns. The example I've used before with somebody is they're like, oh, but isn't it awkward? And like, of course you're going to make assumptions because it's just quicker. And I'm like, yeah, can you imagine looking at somebody and just deciding that they look like a Steve and you're going to call them Steve? And how embarrassing would it be to realize you've gotten their name wrong? It's the same with pronouns, normalize asking questions and saying, hey, this is who I am. These are my pronouns. Can I get yours? And there's so many ways that we can basically improve the welfare and well-being of trans individuals by just normalizing having a conversation about it, having a dialogue, and being open and upfront about our own identities as well. The taboo comes from the fear of having these conversations. The reason why it's so stigmatized is because it still makes people uncomfortable. We still think it's something that we can't discuss. And there is nothing shameful or embarrassing about being trans. I'm pretty sure everyone here will talk about the joy and the excitement of belonging to a community, authentically being who we are, and wanting to talk about that as well, as long as we aren't kind of being brought on board to educate somebody every time that we talk to them. But there's nothing wrong with being open and proud of your trans identity. And the more that there is a dialogue around the kind of wonder and sense of belonging that can come from being openly trans, I think the easier it's going to be for everybody to have conversations about this subject.
Thanks, Georgie. Andi, do you have a quick top tip?
It's not going to solve the world's problems, but flying the flags during the specific months and showing you've got a visible statement of inclusion at your reception desk, in your office, whatever, encouraging those safe spaces to grow and propagate, it will help. Let the flags amplify your voices as allies.
And it will show your customers, tenants and residents also that you're a safe space for them
It makes
to
it
live.
feel.
Yeah. Thank you. Majojo, a final quick top tip from you.
Yeah, I was going to say don't make assumptions, but Georgie covered that. But I would say if you ever tempted to think it doesn't really relate to me, I don't really need to think about it, think again, because there's the strongest chance that somebody you love around you is transgender. They just haven't come out yet. So think again.
Fantastic. And my final top tip is, if anything you've heard today, you feel like you need more support on, you'd like more advice, whether that's with policy, whether that's with training, maybe you want some counselling or some coaching where you're dealing with situations that you feel are out of your sphere of comfort, then please do contact HDN, Housing Diversity Network. Your membership does give you access to people and support that we can help you with this. So make that contact. And if you're not a member of HDN, this has been a great time to, again, make contact to become a member. So thank you so much for joining in today. I'd like to thank all my panelists, Georgie, Andi and Majojo. Finally, my name is Joanne Lockwood and I've enjoyed being your panel host today. Have a great weekend. And remember, tomorrow is Trans Day of Remembrance. So maybe give a pause, reflect on the trans people that have passed away, not just in the last year, but over time. So thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks very much.